From the recordings of Dr. Derek Morrigan, lead mortician at Hillbrook Asylum. Yes, because of the fact that there have been more deaths here than ever. The morgue has become quite active lately, so they need someone to take care of things properly. I have just been delivered the body of patient 425 who has been drowned to death, no doubt from quote-unquote patient 893. Yeah, 'cause I'm totally gonna believe she did it. I really shouldn't be surprised if that's the case, considering all of the other things we've seen so far, but I really doubt she's responsible. Yeah, you'll need a lot of context for this one. To understand the full story, we need to go back to the early years of Hillbrook Asylum. One of the biggest problems about Hillbrook is that there's a really small river not too far from the building. Crossing this river gets you to a small wooded area. The river was supposedly the dwelling place of an aquatic spirit, though now nobody seems to care about it. So, naturally, many inmates use that to their advantage when trying to escape. The river is quite slow moving, so it's not all that hard to swim in it or to cross to the other side. What's worse is that some locals used to live not that far from the asylum, though many have moved since its opening. Still to this day, a few people still live there, most likely due to financial issues. Now that you know that, let's talk about when this story properly began. Once upon a time, there was a girl called Lorelei Rins. She was an only child and was raised by her mother, Naomi. Sadly, Naomi had become estranged with her own parents and had severed ties with most of her friends. Lorelei's father also wasn't part of the picture, which meant dearest Naomi had to take care of the 17-year-old Lorelei on her own. Because of financial struggles, Naomi purchased a house not too far from here and began working as a lumberjack for a company. This was intended to be a temporary situation to gain money and hopefully be able to pay for Lorelei's college tuition. Much like her mother, Lorelei never really had any friends. She was a real social outcast since day one and was never really able to make connections with others because, she was constantly moving. Despite this, she had been able to entertain herself with various things. Because of their current situation, she was able to gain a small social following with her neighbors and, the other lumberjacks. While they didn't have a close relationship, she was at least able to enjoy their company from time to time. However, she had a much more important pastime: swimming. Lorelei adored being underwater. She loved nothing more than sinking, watching as everything was calm and still. This was, sadly, something she could never do anymore, because they didn't own a bath or a pool, and sadly, it wasn't like there was a lake or a river anywhere nearby, right? It was a hot Thursday morning. Cicada were chirping and birds sang. Lorelei was dying of heat as she lay on her bed. Her sweat felt like it was vaporizing on her very body. The fan had been broken for a week, and her internet connection had been cut. Pretty much everyone else had gone to work or was in the city. Bored out of her mind, Lorelei decided to take a nice, calming walk through the woods. Her mother warned her not to do this because of how dangerous the woods actually are, but Lorelei had come prepared. She had brought a knife, just in case any animals would attack. She had continued her walk, sensing no trouble, until something caught her gaze. A fragment of light shined and illuminated her face in a nice green color. She started walking in the light's direction to see what exactly was going on. The sun seemed to loom over her, curious to see what she was doing. She eventually saw the source of the light, and she couldn't believe it. It was a slow-moving river, similar to a lake. The water was a dark shade of green and hummed slightly as it moved. Lorelei stood in shock, watching in awe as she had finally found what she had wanted for so long. She sat in silence, watching the waves slowly ripple in front of her. The water wasn't too shallow, but she could still see some rocks sparkling at the bottom. She approached it, slowly dipping her hand into the water. It was cold. Her hand seemed to rejuvenate as it disappeared into the murky depths. A small splash noise could be heard, and a smile formed on Lorelei's face. She slowly entered the water. A sensation of ecstasy washed over her as she went deeper. This had felt so calming. Before she had known it, she was sinking. The light from the surface was fading away. She landed on the sand, softly forming around her body, the water softly whistling as it passed her. She wanted to live that moment forever, but she knew she'd have to come up for air at some point. She shot up, quickly breaking the surface. She felt every breath course through her entire body. She slowly felt more calm. Suddenly she shrieked. Standing in front of her was a man, standing tall, with black paint around his eyes and a long, black, scruffy beard. He smiled, showing off his severely decayed teeth. She irked back, surprised by him. Grinning, he asked her if she knew who he was, to which the frightened girl shook her head. The eyes of the man lit up. He shoved his hand into the water and grabbed the girl's arm, pulling her closer to him. He looked into her eyes directly and said, "Name's Georgia Trent, former resident of Hillbrook Asylum." His face contorted with glee. "And I've wanted to kill for quite a while." Lorelei tried pulling back, kicking at him, screaming with terror. Georgie then proceeded to pull out something large and shiny. Lorelei cried out, seeing it. It was the knife she had brought to protect herself. Georgie taunted her with it, playing with it. He tackled the girl. They sunk deeper into the water, the knife shining through the darkness, lighting up his monstrous face. She was terrified. She knew this would be the end. She was just a child, and he was a deranged psychopath. His hand clamped down on her throat. His fingers coiled around her like a snake. He lifted the knife, preparing to deliver the killing blow. The girl's eyes closed, knowing the futility of her actions. But then, something else happened. She felt his entire mass lift off her. It wasn't clear why, but he was seemingly pushed off her. Lorelei, seizing the opportunity, darted out of the water, scraping at everything for dear life. She was at the surface and swam quickly. Each stroke felt slow and muddy. As she crawled on the mainland, she turned back and saw Georgie clawing at the air, screaming. He looked at her with pleading eyes. Tears gushed down his cheeks. He belted out a few words that sounded like, "Make it stop." He was then dragged under, a cloud of bubbles forming at the surface. It slowly died down, but a hand tried breaking for the surface. At first, Lorelei couldn't understand what had happened, until the body slowly rose up. Georgie's lifeless corpse floated on the surface, his eyes bloodshot and gray. The knife had been planted into his stomach. However, what horrified Lorelei the most was the fact that a large symbol had been cut into Georgie's flesh. After seeing this, she grabbed her clothes and ran for the forest, leaving this spectacle behind. She looked back once, and seemingly saw a figure in the water. The body was discovered 2 days later. The corpse went down the river and arrived in a more populous area. However, the knife had seemingly disappeared. To this day, we haven't been able to find it. Lorelei didn't tell her mother what had happened, but Naomi noticed something. Lorelei had become unresponsive and more distant than ever. Every time Naomi tried to have a serious talk with her daughter, Lorelei seemed uncaring and apathetic. She was always locked in her room. As days went on, Naomi noticed other weird things, such as the fact that more and more inmates were found dead, and strange, inhuman noises could be heard from her daughter's room. Before they got there, Lorelei had sometimes phases where she would lock herself in her room, but These never lasted more than a few hours, and Naomi hadn't into any arguments with her daughter in quite a while. It was all such a mess for both of them. Then, one night, Naomi had arrived home late. She had decided to take an extra shift to gain some more money. Driving back home, she noticed that it started raining. The woman entered her house, as usual. She dumped her things on a chair and grabbed the can of beer. As she approached her room, something caught her eye. Lorelei's door was open. Naomi stared at it for a moment, thinking about everything that has been going on with her daughter, and took a peek inside. She froze in horror. She slowly opened the rest of the door to see if it had really been it. Lorelei was missing, and her room was covered in scratches. Naomi immediately called her various neighbors and asked them if any of them had seen Lorelei. None of them knew where she had gone. They slowly started splitting up, each armed with nothing but a flashlight. Naomi was on her own and was searching as quickly as she could. Thousands of thoughts flashed through her mind. What happened? Why did it happen? Could this have to do with Lorelei's recent behavior? Before she knew it, there was a violent rushing sound. It was as if thousands of things were being shifted viciously. Naomi slowly followed to the source of the noise, unsure whether it was safe to see. What she saw was horrible beyond belief. It was the shadowy figure of a young woman, seemingly drowning. She tossed and turned, struggling to get out of the water. She sent out a shrilling cry before she was pulled violently underwater. Panicking, Naomi rushed to the river bank. She couldn't let an innocent person die, and for all she knew, that could have been her daughter. Naomi dove into the river and tried to look for the woman. What she saw was far more gruesome. Now, keep in mind, this took place at night, so the reliability of this is questionable at best, but Naomi's flashlight could work underwater. Despite this, Naomi found the woman pretty quickly, in a horrible condition. A dark, watery silhouette held the woman tightly and slashed at her, leaving large gashes at her flesh. The woman was not her daughter, but an inmate of Hillbrook Asylum, 250 to be exact. The silhouette continued to attack her, carving a symbol into her chest. Then the silhouette turned to the frightened Naomi, who immediately tried to swim away. The figure slowly followed, holding the inmate's body like a trophy. Naomi broke the water's surface and reached the shore, puking all over the place as she did so. She heard water violently rustle, knowing full well the culprit was behind her. Naomi turned violently, scared out of her mind. There, her attacker stood tall, imposing, and proud. They knew what they had done, and they were glad Naomi had seen it. Naomi's eyes widened as tears began to trickle down. She froze in horror as she looked at the face of her daughter, who held the inmate's body in her arms. Lorelei smiled sweetly at her mother, delicately putting the body down and asking, "Isn't it wonderful?" Naomi was sobbing. She had realized that her own daughter was responsible for the murders of all those escapees. Naomi glared at Lorelei with bloodshot eyes and yelled, "Wonderful? How could any of this be wonderful? It's inhuman!" Lorelei looked down at her mother. Her sweet smile melted away and gave way to a monstrous scowl. Lorelei started simmering with sheer anger. This was so important to her, and her own mother was now calling it inhuman. Now, I don't know if this next part is actually real or if this is just Naomi's delusions from learning of her daughter's murders, but supposedly Lorelei, seething with fury, started to change. Her whole body had become a dark, transparent shade of blue. It also started rippling slowly, fluctuating on its own. Before Naomi could do anything, Lorelei's body then morphed into a living wave and crashed against Naomi, hitting her really hard. Then the wave turned around and pushed Naomi's head into the river. She kicked and screamed as the creature seemingly pushed her head tightly into the waves, its mass wrapped around her neck. The water core clutching her throat then changed and gave place to a wet palm. Lorelei had taken back her original form and was glaring down at her mother. She was yelling unintelligible words as she pushed her mother's head under water. All that Naomi could hear was, "I am Nyx, protector of the waters." Naomi was losing her strength. She could barely hear. She could barely think. All of it was so painful. Her body started to tense up as the light started to fade. She felt like she was seconds away from dying. And what a fate this would be, getting drowned by your own daughter. Then, suddenly, some of Naomi's lumberjack friends came on the scene and saw the travesty. Lorelei turned in horror, surprised at this. Before she could do anything, one of the men hit her with a flashlight, knocking her out cold. They called the police shortly after, an ambulance eventually arriving on scene. Naomi's wounds were tended to, and they even managed to save patient 250, who was inches away from death's door. Naomi never really did recover. She moved away and worked in construction instead. Anything would have been better than staying here. She tried visiting Lorelei a couple times, but it never really worked out. The visits would always end with a lot of yelling and cursing. After her last visit, Naomi decided to create a social group dedicated to helping those affected by Hillbrook's patients. I suppose this is where you'd think the story ends, but that sadly isn't the case. You see, Naomi's last visit with Lorelei was also the day something else happened. One of our doctors, Romano, went insane. He went on a short killing spree, murdering one doctor, one patient, and a couple security guards. He was subdued, but while he was fighting, many inmates saw this as a chance to escape, Lorelei being one of them. She proceeded to kick one of the guards down. The floor had been recently washed, so he hit his head pretty hard on the way down. The details are pretty fuzzy on what happened next, but Naomi somehow was able to escape the asylum by hiding from the staff and cameras. However, many of the guards saw her fleeing the asylum. They chased her down, sprinting as fast as they could to get her, until they got to the river. She was panting heavily as she got close. God knows what was going on through her mind. She looked at it, smiling sadistically. Before any of the guards could detain her, she fell into the river. The guards were about to go, looking around through the river, when she slowly floated back to the surface. The water around her started to turn red. It seems that she had hit her head on a large stone at the bottom of the river. She died on impact. This leads us to present day, where the most peculiar events have started transpiring. Shortly after 893's death, 250 was found dead in her cell. Her sink had been overflowing with water. She had drowned to death, supposedly in the sink. A message was engraved onto her bed, saying, "Beware of Nyx, protector of the river." The only thing security cameras picked up was a watery figure standing in front of 250. And then, there's the case of 425, who tried escaping last week. He was recently discovered, with the same emblem Nyx makes on the rest of her victims. So, what do I think of all this? I honestly don't know. I mean, we've seen weird things before, but the ghost of some random girl who has the ability to become a living mass of water? I'm sorry, but there's just too many things that are vague. I'm pretty sure Naomi was just imagining things, since Lorelei never used any powers when she was in our custody. However, I will admit, there have been sightings of a watery figure both here at the asylum and near the river. Regardless of what actually is going on, I've had enough of this, so please, don't go near the river. It's only caused us problems so far. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna need a drink. Hopefully something stronger than a glass of water.